Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I like to talk about, and I know you do too, you sick-minded, intellectual, beautiful-minded freak. I forgot what I usually say, and my mustache fell off. Today, we will be covering Do I have hair in my mouth? Oh, I do. Today, we are going to be covering 3 bone-chilling Canadian murders that I am certain you have not heard about. And not just any murders, but multiple murders, aka serial killers. So let's unbuckle your seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into these Canadian crime cases together. But before we get into the video, I'd like to thank today's awesome sponsor, which is Raycon. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. As you guys know, I am a big Raycon proponent. Not only because they are extremely affordable, but because they produce high quality sound that other premium brands do, but with an affordable price. And I use Raycons quite literally every single day, whether I'm just sitting on the couch, drawing while listening to music, or I'm out on a walk with my doggo, or on a run, which is less frequent, or just traveling wherever. Because the Raycon everyday earbuds are made to make your everyday a lot easier. And what's great about them also is that they have 32-hour battery life and multi-point connectivity that lets you pair it with 2 devices at once. There's also active noise cancellation, which makes my flights a lot easier when I can tune out the babies crying in the background. And they have a variety of very vibrant colors, so you can customize your Raycons to your own style. I love the cases that they have for them that you can just take off and put on. I have a couple different ones, but this one has been my favorite. And not only do these look great, but they also support wireless charging. So I don't even need to take off the cover to get 90 minutes of battery in just 10 minutes. And now for the shake test. We're good. So click the link down in the description below and go to buyraycon.com/KMK to get 20 to 50% off site-wide. You heard me right. You could get up to 50% off everything on Raycon's site when you go to buyraycon.com/KMK. So make sure to do that and go buy some Raycons today. Thank you to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Let's get back to it. So first thing, we are going to talk about the Calgary serial killer. So in the 1970s, a very strange sequence of murders occurred in Calgary, Canada. And there is a little catch to this story, but these murders were once unsolved until the evolution of DNA technology came to play and linked these crimes to a particular man, but we will talk about that after. So 4 women would be killed between the years of 1976 and 1977. Patricia McQueen, Eva Dvorak, Melissa Rohorick, and Barbara McLean. So let's talk about the first victims. The first 2 murders were actually friends and students in grades 8 and 9 who attended the Easel Bazalgette Junior High School in Calgary. And Patricia McQueen resided at 2220 37th Street Southeast in the Forest Heights area, while her friend Eva lived at 3131 30 Avenue Southeast in Dover. And they would be last seen hitchhiking. Don't hitchhike, please. At 12th Street and 9th Avenue Southeast on February 12th, 1976. And the girls were supposedly told to leave the premises after being found drinking and obviously being underage at the time. They then were seen as well out partying for the next few days, taking different drugs such as LSD, weed, and drinking alcohol as well. And a neighbor then saw them hitchhiking and they were offered a ride, which thankfully, they declined. But after this, they completely disappeared, and there was no trace of them ever being alive after this. And it wouldn't be until February 15th, about 3 days after, when their bodies were found under an overpass, unfortunately named Happy Valley. And an autopsy would reveal that they died from asphyxiation and clear signs of SA, although there were no marks on their necks to indicate asphyxiation in the way of choking. And the autopsy would also conclude that the drugs in their system were not the cause of of their deaths either. And the clothes and the positions the bodies were found in suggested that the bodies were just dumped and left. And whatever happened to them did not occur in Happy Valley. And unfortunately, this is where this particular case would run cold, and no answers and no suspects would be found for decades. And the next victim of the Calgary serial killer was Melissa Rarick, who was a 20-year-old woman originally from Windsor, Ontario, and later moved to Calgary in 1976, hoping to find more work. And she would eventually find a job as a housekeeper at a hotel and lived at the YMCA, as money was tight. And this would unfortunately lead to her death, as one of her hobbies was spending time outdoors. And since money was tight, she also decided to hitchhike. Don't hitchhike out west to enjoy some hiking in the mountains for the weekend on September 15th, 1976. And she would be last seen by her roommate at the YMCA, supposedly around 9:30 p.m. However, a Calgary transit driver reported that he may have dropped Melissa off near Highway 1 in the Bowness area. Strangely enough, right next to Happy Valley, where the other two girls were found. And the next morning, September 16th, 1976, a body would be found in a ditch about 22 kilometers outside the city on a gravel road at around 10:50 a.m. near the Trans-Canada Highway. And she would be found fully clothed and had all of her possessions, including her cash. And the autopsy revealed that there had been a struggle with damage to her head specifically. There were also signs of SA, and the cause of death was also asphyxiation, just like the other two victims. However, found in her hand were long black hairs that weren't hers, because assuming during the struggle she probably was fighting and she pulled the hairs out of the killer's head and held on to them after she died. But with limited technology at the time, the culprit could not be identified yet. Which brings us to our fourth and final victim, Barbara McLean. So the supposed last victim of the Calgary serial killer was Barbara McLean, who was 19 years old and was employed at a bank and was originally from Nova Scotia. And 6 months later, she would be killed by this mysterious serial killer. An overly social and free-spirited soul, she would often go out with her friends to local bars. And living with her boyfriend at the time, she and her partner decided to go to Highlander Bar and meet up with some friends on February 25th, 1977. And according to witnesses, she was highly intoxicated this night and actually had a fight with her boyfriend, which eventually led to him being evicted from the bar. And she would continue without him and continue partying with her friends till about 2:30 a.m. when the bar closed. And she would then reunite with her boyfriend in their car, where the argument developed and led her to get out of the car, being left behind by her stupid boyfriend in the parking lot alone at night. And being extremely intoxicated, she had no other way to get home except for hitchhiking, because Uber and I guess taxis weren't really a thing. I don't know. I mean, I know that Uber wasn't around, but I'm assuming this area probably just didn't have a lot of taxis at the time. And her plan was to go to another party to keep the buzz going. I mean, she was 19, so I understand. I was never much of a party animal, but she would unfortunately never arrive at that next party spot. So as the next morning started, she was nowhere to be seen. However, she would then be discovered by a passerby who was walking his dog, finding her body on a Calgary road right outside the Calgary city limits. She was reported fully clothed, again with all of her belongings. However, her jacket was inside out, and she had obvious markings on her body from bruises and more. And no signs of SA were mentioned in the early reports until there was seminal fluid that was recovered at the crime scene later on. But again, no suspects were ever found until decades later. As technology would evolve, they would finally develop and reopen the case to catch the Calgary serial killer. And multiple more disappearances and murders would happen over the years in Calgary. However, it wasn't until very recently that some of these would actually be solved and be linked to a man named Gary Allen Srieri. So let's talk about this piece of shit and how technically this case wasn't officially solved. So Gary Allen Srieri, if I'm saying your name wrong, I don't give a because you're a piece of shit, was a man with a criminal record, let's just say that. He was born in 1942 in Oak Park, Illinois, and he truly was a criminal at heart, with theft, and evolved into charged convict after being arrested in Los Angeles for brutal SA grape, sodomy, and kidnapping. Just like, he really ticked him off really quick, just all the bad things, except for murder, yet. And he would then serve his time in San Quentin prison and was released. But the crimes obviously did not stop there. In 1974, for example, he was posted for bail for yet another grape charge in California, escaping the United States to avoid responsibility. Look at this piece of shit. He looks like he just looks like it. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? He's got one of those faces just... I tell you what. And his time in Canada was chock full of more crimes. Illegally coming into the country and living under multiple aliases to hide from the law. And these names ranged from Willie Long, Rex Long, and William Rex Long. I guess this guy really liked T-Rexes or something. I don't really know. I don't know. Maybe he's got like really short arms or something. I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised. Just... But he would then spend most of his time working menial jobs under these aliases, usually for like under the table cash, as to not have his name or names linked to anything. And he would spend most of his time in Alberta and British Columbia, shout out to British Columbia, between 1976 and 2003. And he would change his vehicles and disguises frequently so as to not raise suspicion. So between 1976 and 1977, when the 4 murders took place, he was frequently evading the law thanks to the lack of technology for forensics, and also changing disguises and more, like we talked about. He would also continually move around constantly as to evade the law, making it extremely hard for the police to nail him down. And there are questions from authorities if he truly was the one responsible for the 4, but it's unclear. The force never truly closed the cases, reopening them frequently and exchanging notes between precincts. And in the 1990s, they would reopen the cases to investigate the DNA traces left behind at the scenes of the crime. And in 2003, they created a DNA profile for this unknown man to hopefully find more evidence in the future. And what they were able to find was a link between Melissa and Barbara, and it would be found that they were murdered by the same person. And thankfully, the case would finally actually be solved due to the evolution of the DNA technology, and the case would be reopened in 2023. And these connections finally linked to the culprit, Gary Allen Srury, who was completely off the radar for the initial investigation. But thanks to the help of the US, the cross-reference databases had matched. However, and this is where he wasn't technically caught, died. The mother died before he could have got caught. And he died in 2011. So it was like 12 years after when he got caught. So just bullshit. And it is very unsure if those were the only crimes or murders that he committed in Canada. I'm going to safely assume he's murdered a lot more people, because his history just speaks for itself. And there's no doubt, as more investigations are reopened, the families of the victims can finally be given closure, knowing that the deaths of their families had been solved. At least we have that. At least we have closure for the families. But Gary is truly looking up at us from down below. Just flaming, just boiling and burning and broiling in hell. And this is the victims' families' responses to the solved murders. Quote unquote, saying, "We would like to thank from the bottom of our hearts the team of individuals who worked so many days and countless hours on solving this cold case. Without them, we would still not know today what happened to our sister Patsy, Patricia, and her friend Eva. We will forever be grateful and thankful that they never gave up on our girls," said the McQueen family in a statement. And the DeVorks family said that they are thankful for the closure they have been given as well, saying, quote unquote, "Eva was loved and cherished by her family and all who knew her. Her bright smile and bubbly personality was contagious and lit up any room. When Eva was around, there was no sitting still, always dancing and singing any time of the day. She enjoyed spending time with her sisters and cousins while swimming, roller skating, and ice skating." And from Melissa's family, "Our message is one about Melissa, being a fun, loving, adventurous, and hardworking person. She was honest, positive person who trusted people. She enjoyed traveling to Banff," I love Banff, "for her love of nature, but also to travel for her curiosity about seeing Canada." And the McLeans also expressed appreciation finally having the answers to questions that we've had to live with all these years. So I think that's like the most important part, is that these families got closure. But there are a lot of other families who had people that went missing and murdered that are still unsolved and might be linked to Gary, piece of shit Gary. So hopefully they're able to figure those out. But that is all we have for the first case, and we move on to the second uncaught killer. And this is actually like plural uncaught killers. There could be a span of serial killers for this case, and that is the Highway of Tears. And for those of you who don't know, the Highway of Tears refers to a remote and infamous stretch of Highway 16 in British Columbia, Canada, where numerous Indigenous women and girls, along with some non-Indigenous women, but mostly Indigenous women, have gone missing or been found murdered over several decades, stretching over 720 kilometers, or for my Americans, about 450 miles from Prince George to Prince Rupert. This highway has been the site of tragedies that have left many families shattered and questions unanswered. And the ongoing mysteries surrounding these cases has not only exposed systemic issues within the investigation processes, but also highlighted the vulnerability of Indigenous women in Canadian society. Because between 1969 and 2011, over 40 women, most of which are Indigenous women, have gone missing or have been murdered near or alongside the highway. And Indigenous women in Canada specifically face disproportionately high rates of violence and systemic neglect from law enforcement and government institutions. And the cases on Highway 16 have gained international attention, underscoring the need for structural changes to address not just these specific cases, but also the broader national crisis. So let's get into some of the victims and some of the suspects. And I quite literally cannot talk about every single victim because there are so many. There are so many more than 40. So I will just talk about some of the better known cases because a lot of them, like I said, are just kind of like brushed under the rug. So I will highlight some of the ones that are more known, and then we'll get into who some of the suspects are and what some of the theories are. So we're going to start off with Gloria Moody. Gloria Moody was aged 26, and she was a mother of two from Bella Coola First Nation. And on October 25th, 1969, Gloria was last seen leaving a bar in Williams Lake. She had been out spending an evening just socializing with friends and partying, as you do, because there's not a lot else to do up there, I'm going to be honest. But unfortunately, her body would be discovered the next day in a remote cattle field outside of the town, approximately 10 kilometers from where she was last seen. And the autopsy would show that Gloria had been beaten to death. The cause of death was determined by blunt force trauma and exposure to the elements. And despite an investigation, no suspects have been publicly identified, and her murder remains unsolved, not unlike all the other victims I'm going to talk about. And next is Monica Ignis. 15-year-old Monica Ignis was a young student attending school in Thornhill, British Columbia. And on December 13th, 1974, Monica would be walking home from her school, Thornhill, near Terrace, when she disappeared. And 6 days after her disappearance, her body would be found in a forested area off Highway 16 near Terrace. And Monica had been strangled to death, and no suspects had been publicly named, and her case remains unsolved. Next, we have Maureen Mosey. 33-year-old Maureen Mosey was a non-Indigenous woman living in Alberta, and she was known to hitchhike regularly across British Columbia and Alberta. Don't hitchhike. And Maureen would be last seen hitchhiking near Salmon Arm in British Columbia on May 8th, 1981. And her body would be found the next day along the stretch of Highway 97 near Kamloops, British Columbia, about 150 kilometers south of the Highway of Tears region. And Maureen had also been beaten to death. And despite this case being widely publicized, it remains unsolved with no suspects. And next we have Alberta Williams, who was a 24-year-old Indigenous woman from Gitxsan First Nation in northern British Columbia. And she lived in Prince Rupert, a city near the western end of the Highway of Tears, like we talked about. And on August 26, 1989, Alberta would be last seen leaving a pub in Prince Rupert with her friends and her sister. Alberta and the group of friends had been celebrating the end of the salmon fishing season, but later that night, she would disappear, and her body would be found on September 25th, 1989, in a rural area along the Highway 16 near the Skeena River. And Alberta had been SA'd and strangled to death. And despite extensive investigation at this time, no charges were ever laid. But in 2016, the CBC podcast Missing and Murdered: Who Killed Alberta Williams renewed interest in the case, but it now still remains unsolved. Next, we have Ramona Wilson. 16-year-old Ramona Wilson was a high school student from the Gitxsan Nation, living in Smithers, British Columbia. And on June 11th, 1994, Ramona was last seen hitchhiking to attend a dance in Hazelton, a small community near Smithers. But unfortunately, she would never arrive to her destination. And Ramona's remains would be found nearly a year later, in April 1995, near the Smithers Airport, not far from Highway 16. And due to the condition of her remains, the cause of death was never actually determined, but investigators suspected foul play. Several items, including rope and other objects, were found near her body, indicating she may have been bound or restrained in some way. Next, we have Ayla Sarek Auger. Ayla was an Indigenous teenager from the Ladli Tene First Nation in Prince George, British Columbia. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And she would be last seen on February 2nd, 2006 in Prince George. George. And she would be last seen walking along Highway 16 when she vanished. And her body would be discovered 1 week later in a ditch along Highway 16, about 15 kilometers outside of Prince George. So she was clearly like picked up or something and then murdered. And the specific cause of her death was not publicly released, but it is known that she was murdered, and her case remains unsolved. And the last victim we're going to talk about, because there's dozens and dozens more, is Tamara Chipman. Tamara Chipman was also an Indigenous woman from the Metlakatla First Nation living in Prince Rupert. And Tamara would be last seen hitchhiking near an intersection along Highway 16 on a road leading to a Prince Rupert industrial site on September 21st, 2005. And she was attempting to hitch a ride home to Terrace. But despite extensive searches, Tamara's body was actually never found. And her family continues to advocate for answers. And her case remains one of the most high-profile unsolved disappearances along the Highway of Tears. And obviously, since Tamara's body had never been found, her case still remains unresolved. So while some of the cases share similarities, such as the women disappearing while hitchhiking, the diversity of the methods of killing, such as strangulation, blunt force trauma, and SA, complicates efforts to link the cases to a single perpetrator, which I think it's impossible that this is a single perpetrator, quite literally. And many experts believe that many different killers may have been operating along the Highway of Tears during these years and over the decades, taking advantage of the isolation of the area and the lack of resources for comprehensive investigations. Essentially, it was just a perfect breeding ground for serial killers. So let's go over the leads and suspects. So several very well-known serial killers have been considered suspects in a lot of these unsolved murders along the Highway of Tears. Given the vast span along this geographical isolated area, investigators have entertained the possibility that multiple serial offenders have preyed on the vulnerable women hitchhiking along this remote highway. So first, we'll start with Bobby Jack Fowler. Bobby Jack Fowler was an American drifter with a long criminal history, including SA, attempted murder, and kidnapping. Just ticking all those boxes. He spent a lot of time working as a laborer in Canada and the US in the 1970s and 80s, a period of time when a lot of the murders occurred on the Highway of Tears. And Fowler was definitively linked to a murder that happened in 1974, which was the murder of a 16-year-old girl named Colleen McMillan, one of the youngest victims along the Highway of Tears. And in 2012, advances in DNA technology led to that match between Fowler's DNA and the evidence from Colleen's murder. She would also disappear while hitchhiking, and her body would be found shortly after. But Fowler would die in prison in 2006. But investigators do believe that he was responsible, most likely, for additional murders along the Highway of Tears, and potentially in other parts of the US and Canada. But again, we'll probably never know because he's dead. F you. Burn in hell. Next, we have Cody Legbokov. I don't care, because you're stupid and a piece of shit and you're awful. I don't care. I don't care how you say your name. Anyway, Cody is a convicted Canadian serial killer and responsible for the murders of 4 women, including a teenage girl, between 2009 and 2010. Cody was only 19 years old when he began his killing spree. His victims, including a 15-year-old Lauren Leslie, were all from British Columbia, though not all of them were Indigenous or connected to the Highway of Tears directly. And where Cody's crimes do not precisely fit the pattern of the earlier Highway of Tears murders, his proximity to the region and the nature of his crimes, targeting women in rural areas, have raised suspicion that he could be linked to other unresolved cases. However, there is no conclusive evidence linking him to any of the Highway of Tears victims, technically. And his relative youth at the time of his conviction makes him less likely to have been involved in those earlier cases. But investigators have not completely ruled him out as a suspect for recent disappearances. And that brings us to Edward Dennis Isaac. Edward Dennis Isaac is a lesser-known suspect in the Highway of Tears murders. He was convicted of the brutal rape and murder of a 49-year-old Indigenous woman, Margaret Peggy Nicole, in Prince George in 1981. And Isaac had a history of violence and was known to frequent the Highway 16, the Highway of Tears. And while Isaac was only convicted of 1 murder, his proximity to the Highway of Tears and his violent tendencies had led some to speculate that he may be responsible for some of the unresolved murders. However, no direct evidence links him to the Highway of Tears cases beyond his violent history. But you could probably safely assume that wasn't his first victim, based off of his history. Which brings us to a very, I think, likely suspect, the Green River Killer, otherwise known as Gary Ridgway. And he is one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Let me know down below if you actually want me to do a deep dive on Gary Ridgway, because my God, it's something. But anyway, he's responsible for the murders of at least 49 women in Washington state during the 1980s to the 1990s. And most of his victims were vulnerable women, many of whom were ladies of the night or runaways. Ridgway's killings primarily took place in Washington, but the geographic proximity of his hunting grounds to British Columbia has led to the speculation that he could have gone across the border to continue hunting, because the Pacific Northwest region of British Columbia has been a hotbed for serial killers, and the Green River Killer's MO, targeting women along highways, fits the pattern of the Highway of Tears murders. However, again, there was no concrete evidence linking Ridgway to any Canadian murders, and he has never been formally named a suspect in the Highway of Tears cases. And next we have Keith Hunter Jesperson, otherwise known as the Happy Face Killer. Also, let me know if you wanted me to do a deep dive on him, because he is something else too. But Keith, otherwise known as a Happy Face Killer, murdered at least 8 women in the United States during the 1990s. And Jesperson, a long-haul trucker, traveled extensively across North America, leaving a trail of victims in multiple states. And he earned his nickname by drawing happy faces on letters he sent to the media, taunting authorities about his crimes, aka a piece of shit. Jesperson's occupation as a long-haul trucker gave him the mobility to commit murders across vast distances, aka possibly the Highway of Tears. And he would admit murdering multiple victims over those span of years that the Highway of Tears victims started to pile up. However, no direct evidence has ever connected him to any specific case in the region, but I feel like it's also fair to assume. And last but not least, we have the infamous Robert Pickton, which if you don't know who that is, you could check out this video for a deep dive, but my god, he's a piece of shit, and my god, he's dead. He died. He died like months after I did that deep dive on him. I feel like it's probably for the best. But anyway, Robert Pickton is one of Canada's most infamous serial killers. I'd say the most infamous serial killer. But he was only convicted of murdering 6 women, but suspected of killing many more, possibly up to 49. And Robert Pickton said that he wished he could have got to 50. So it's like almost a guaranteed 49. I hate him so much. He lived 20 minutes away from me. Anyway, Pickton also preyed on vulnerable women, mostly those that were ladies of the night as well in Vancouver's downtown east side. And he would lure them back to his pig farm in Port Coquitlam, where they were murdered and their remains were disposed of in his pig farm, basically. But although his crimes did mostly take place in Vancouver, the proximity to Highway 16 and the nature of his victims, often marginalized women, has led some to speculate that he could be one of the people that murdered women on the Highway of Tears. However, again, no evidence has been directly linked to Pickton. And given his geographical focus, more so in the Vancouver area, it's probably more unlikely. I'd say this is probably the most unlikely instance, but he's still a piece of shit and he's dead. So, but the idea of multiple serial killers operating along the Highway of Tears is like the most horrifying thing ever. And while some serial killers like Bobby Jack Fowler have been definitively linked to a victim along the highway, others just remain speculative suspects due to the lack of conclusive evidence. So it is likely that the combination of factors, including serial offenders, local predators, and possibly just opportunistic killings by individuals passing through the region, contributed to the ongoing tragedy of the Highway of Tears. And despite the ongoing investigation and public interest, many of these cases remain unsolved, leaving open the possibility that some of these notorious killers may still be linked to some of these unresolved murders in the area. And I think these women need justice. So I think shedding some light on the case might help in some way, but I really think these families need closure. And it's in my home, you know? So yeah, that is our second Uncaught killer, and that brings us to our last. And this last murder is probably the strangest murder yet. To preface, despite the murder taking place in 2010, it remains unsolved. Furthermore, if you look up the murders, there is barely any information available. And many of the links that claim to have information about the cases often result in 505 errors. This indicates that there are issues on the server sides and could potentially point to some sort of covering up. And this is the case of the 2 Ma family murders. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I've looked everywhere to how to pronounce this, and for some reason I cannot find it, so I'm praying that that's how you say it. On August 6th, 2010 in Regina, Canada. Residents of a local townhome began to complain of a horrible smell coming from one of the neighbors' residences. And as soon as the property manager was notified, they went over to check on the small family that resided there. And upon opening the door and walking in, they were horrified to see the family of 3 brutally murdered and rotting in their townhome. And the details of the crime scene have never been released or revealed. But it is said that the actual crime scene was so atrocious that the body's decomposition process was expedited due to the nature of their injuries. But the one definite piece of information that we do have about the crime scene is that a gun was not used in the murders. And the 3 victims were Gray Natu, aged 31, his wife Mama, aged 28, and their 3-year-old son, 7 June 2. And it is believed that the family had been deceased for at least 1 day before being discovered by the property manager. And as soon as the bodies were discovered, a massive search began with at least 25 Regina officers working at one time. And during the investigation, it was found that the family were Burmese refugees who came to Canada from a refugee camp in Myanmar. And they came to Canada in hopes to find a better life. And the neighbors within the complex were interviewed, and they claimed that the family was extremely quiet and the wife and child hardly ever left the complex, unless the father was home. And Gray worked at a recycling plant, and Mama was a stay-at-home mom. And neighbors had also commented on how Gray was seemingly a very paranoid man. When he would leave from his home to go to work, he was seen checking outside his front door multiple times, ensuring that it was locked before he left. And it was said that suspicious-looking people went in and out of the home on a regular basis. But the priest of the church that the family attended claimed that the family was very happy to be in Canada, but that they were struggling to make ends meet with just the father working. And this could explain the sketchy people leaving and entering the house, because the family could have been engaging in some sort of illegal activities for extra cash. And maybe that was why they were so brutally murdered, because of a drug deal or something else that went wrong. And the only real piece of evidence that we have of the night of the family getting murdered comes from one of the neighbors named Mandy, who claimed to hear what sounded like fireworks coming from the 2 residents. More specifically, she said, quote unquote, "I know what fireworks sound like, and it wasn't fireworks. It was very loud. It was close. Very close." What the was it, Mandy? But it stated explicitly that a gun was not involved in the murder of the 2 families. So what was Mandy hearing through the walls of her townhome? Furthermore, she heard loud pops through the wall, but not screaming. And it seems a little suspicious, because if the murder was so gruesome as investigators stated it was, then someone probably should have been heard screaming at least once. And if there was no screaming, then it was possible that maybe the murderer wasn't alone, and maybe it was a group big enough for members to bind and maybe gag the family. And during the investigation, the investigators interviewed quite literally hundreds of people from the Burmese and Karen. Not just a Karen, but the Karen people are an ancient ethnic population from Burma. And it was hard to gain any information at first because of the language barrier, but an interpreter was brought in. And still, the investigators learned nothing. And according to the local Karen population, they believed that the police had the wrong suspects and that nobody in the Karen community would have committed such heinous acts against one of their own people. Even more strange is the fact that people from the 2, the interceptor responsible for interviewing the Karen community, went home early and left many people's testimonies off the official record simply because they were not interviewed. In an article, it says, an RCMP officer who speaks Karen was brought in to help during the early stages of the police investigation. It was expected he would be able to help build bridges and gain information on the murder from some of the estimated 600 Karen people currently living in the city. He returned home to British Columbia at the end of January. Quite a few Karen people were unhappy with the officer cooperation with the police, especially when it came to dealing with the people of interest that the police were investigating, according to Wyatt. So no suspects were ever found or listed, and the family of 3 never got their justice. So the cold case of the Tuma family remains unsolved to this day. And the city of Regina has put out a $50,000 reward for anyone who can provide any new evidence or information about the case. But no one has come forward yet. But it seems that this case remains cold because of poor handling by the Regina police, along with the language barrier and the unknown circumstances surrounding the family. So hopefully someday the murder can be brought to justice, but until then, we won't know. So that concludes the video. I hope I was able to shed some light on some really interesting cases for you guys. And if you have any suggestions for any other true crime deep dives or any other kinds of deep dives, let me know down in the comments below. But yeah, stay safe out there, and I'm gonna go to bed. Bye.